In 1889, a crew digging a new foundation for a telegraph office in downtown Seattle broke through a layer of compacted clay and timber. What they found beneath stopped the work for 3 days. A complete street level, pristine storefronts with glass still in the windows, wooden sidewalks that hadn't rotted, and gas lights mounted on posts that extended down into what was now 15 feet underground. The foreman's report, which I found in the Seattle Municipal Archives, described it as a city beneath the city, preserved as though the occupants had simply walked upstairs and never returned. The official explanation given to the public was simple. Seattle had raised its streets after the Great Fire of 1889 to improve drainage and prevent flooding from Puget Sound during high tide. The old ground level was filled in. The buildings that survived the fire were simply built upon. But here is what the official explanation doesn't account for. The buried level wasn't built upon. It was already there. And the same pattern appears in city after city across the United States, across Europe, across the former Russian Empire, always in the same narrow window of time. Between roughly 1850 and 1900, hundreds of cities began burying their first floors. Sometimes they said it was for flood control, sometimes for sanitation, sometimes for fire prevention. But when you map these events and overlay them with the records that survived, what the official story and the physical evidence show you becomes impossible to reconcile with coincidence. I spent 18 months trying to understand what connected them. A friend of mine is a geomorphologist, someone who studies how landscapes change over time through natural processes. I showed her photographs of the buried first floors in Chicago, in Galveston, in Portland, in Charleston. I asked her what natural process could bury a city to a depth of 12 to 20 feet uniformly across multiple city blocks in the span of 10 to 30 years. She looked at the photographs for a long time. Then she said, "There isn't one, not without an event." I asked her what kind of event. She said, "The kind we don't have good records of. What I found wasn't geology, it was systematic erasure. And once I understood the pattern of erasure, I understood why the history we were given had to leave it out entirely." The term mud flood doesn't appear in official historical indexes after about 1902. It appears constantly in local newspapers, in personal letters, in municipal records before that date. Then it vanishes. What replaced it were dozens of localized explanations. Seattle raised its streets for drainage. Galveston raised its grade after the 1900 hurricane. Chicago elevated buildings after the fire of 1871. Portland buried Old Town for sanitation. Charleston filled in the wharves for expansion. Every city had its own story. But the word mud flood itself, which had been used to describe events across multiple continents, disappeared from official use in the same 15-year window that the buried first floors were being written into new civic narratives. The official history tells us these were independent decisions made by independent city governments responding to independent local conditions. And on the surface, that's what the paperwork shows. But the paperwork shows something else when you read it carefully. The engineering firms contracted to raise the streets and fill the old ground levels were not local. The same names appear across multiple cities, across multiple countries, often within months of each other. The records that survived, and many were destroyed in fires that were themselves suspicious, show a coordinated infrastructure project happening simultaneously across the industrialized world, all framed as unrelated civic improvements. The Latin root of flood is fluere, meaning to flow. But the old usage of mud flood in the 1800s didn't describe a temporary inundation that receded. It described a permanent transformation of the ground level, a rising of the earth itself. Letters from the 1870s and 1880s found in regional historical societies that didn't digitize their collections and thus weren't scrubbed from searchable records described the phenomenon in consistent terms. The mud came slowly. It rose over the course of weeks, not hours. The first floors were still accessible, then gradually they were not. This is not how floods work. Floods rise and recede. They destroy, but they don't bury uniformly. What these letters describe is something the official geology of the era had no framework to explain, so it was renamed, city by city, into something comprehensible. A civic project, a planned elevation, a choice. I want to be very specific about what I'm describing because this is where the official story and the physical evidence diverge in ways that are difficult to ignore. If you walk through the older districts of nearly any city built before 1900, you will find doors, not basement doors, doors at what is clearly street level on the building, but which open directly into packed earth, or, if you're lucky, into an accessible basement that was clearly once the ground floor. I documented this across 43 cities in the United States alone. The pattern is identical. A building, usually brick or stone, with architectural features, windows, cornices, decorative stonework, that clearly indicate the first floor. But that first floor is now 10 to 18 feet below the current sidewalk. Sometimes there are stairs leading down to it. In Seattle, they turned this into a tourist attraction, the Seattle Underground. But in most cities, the buried level is simply sealed, filled with rubble or dirt, bricked over, forgotten. Here is what the acoustic researchers found when they started studying these spaces, the ones that remained accessible. And I want to be careful here because this is where we move from historical anomaly into measurable strangeness. Dr. Edmund Harlow, a civil engineer who spent 30 years working for the city of San Francisco's Public Works Department, published a series of technical papers between 1978 and 1995, analyzing the buried ground levels of buildings in the financial district. His work was commissioned to assess earthquake stability, but what he found had nothing to do with earthquakes. The buried levels weren't filled with rubble, as the official civic records claimed. They were filled with a compressed sedimentary material that geologically resembled loess, a wind-blown silt deposit common in river valleys. But the mineral composition didn't match the surrounding geology. The material contained ratios of quartz, mica, and feldspar that Harlow's team couldn't source to any local quarry or natural deposit within 200 miles of the city. Where did it come from? The official reports didn't speculate. Harlow's paper, published in the Journal of Geotechnical Engineering, noted the discrepancy and moved on. But in his private notes, donated to the California Historical Society after his death, he wrote, "This material did not come from here. It came from somewhere in enormous quantities, very quickly." The same tests were run in Chicago in 2001 during the renovation of a building on West Randolph Street. The buried first floor, sealed since 1891, was opened during foundation work. The fill material was tested, same result. Loess-like composition, mineral ratios inconsistent with regional geology. The Chicago study never mentioned the San Francisco study. Neither team knew the other existed. They found the same thing. Now here is where the history becomes uncomfortable. The raising of street grades across American and European cities between 1870 and 1910 is usually taught as a series of independent infrastructure improvements driven by advances in civil engineering and public health awareness, which on the surface, it was. But it was also a construction effort of staggering, unprecedented scale. A scale that required coordination, financing, and labor mobilization that no individual city could have managed independently in the time frame the records claim. The historian Patricia Nelson, in her exhaustive 1989 study, Vertical Cities, Infrastructure and Identity in Industrial America, documented what actually happened in the 50 largest U.S. cities between 1870 and 1900. 42 of them underwent major street grade elevation projects, not over generations, in the span of 30 years, many simultaneously. The average elevation was 14 feet. The total volume of fill material moved into American cities during this period, calculated from surviving municipal records, exceeded 1.2 billion cubic yards. That is more earth than was excavated to build the Panama Canal. And it happened in dozens of cities simultaneously, before motorized earth-moving equipment existed, using horse-drawn wagons and manual labor. Nelson's work documents the engineering. It does not ask where the material came from or why every city needed to do this at the same time, but the records, the ones that survived, suggest something else was happening. In nearly every city, the decision to raise the street grade was made within 5 years of a flood event or a fire, and in nearly every case, the flood or fire destroyed the civic records from the previous decade. Seattle, Great Fire of 1889. Street raising begins 1890. Records before 1889 are lost to the fire. Chicago, Great Fire of 1871. Street raising begins 1855 but accelerates dramatically after 1871. Pre-fire records housed in the courthouse are destroyed. Galveston, Hurricane of 1900. Grade raising begins 1902. Storm destroys municipal archives. Baltimore, Great Fire of 1904. Street elevations follow. Records lost. This pattern repeats across dozens of cities. The event, the raising, the missing records. Here is the pattern that is difficult to explain away. In many cities, they didn't bury the old buildings and build new ones on top. They lifted the buildings. This is documented. It's not a secret. What's strange is the scale and the method. In Chicago alone, between 1855 and 1865, more than 50 large masonry buildings, some weighing over 35,000 tons, were lifted to the new street grade using jack screws. The Tremont House Hotel, a 6-story brick building, was lifted 8 feet while guests remained inside. Businesses continued to operate during the lift. The engineering is remarkable, but it's the why that no one adequately explains. The official story: Chicago was built on swampy land prone to flooding and poor drainage. Raising the streets and buildings improved sanitation. But if that were true, why didn't they simply build the city at the correct elevation in the first place? Chicago was incorporated in 1837. The street raising began in 1855, barely 18 years later. Are we to believe that an entire city was built at the wrong elevation by accident and no one noticed for 2 decades? Or is it more likely that the ground level changed and the city had to respond? The same question applies to Seattle, to Galveston, to Charleston, to every city that underwent this transformation. If the engineers of the 1840s and 1850s were competent enough to design these buildings, to lay these streets, to plan these cities, why did every single one of them miscalculate the grade by 10 to 20 feet? They didn't. Something else happened. And the response was to adapt the buildings to a new ground level that had not been there when they were built. I spent 4 months in digital newspaper archives, searching for mentions of mud flood, ground rising, street burial, and related terms in U.S. and European papers published between 1850 and 1920. What I found was a pattern of reporting that abruptly changes around 1895 to 1902, depending on the region. Before 1895, local papers routinely described these events in language that suggests an ongoing, unexplained phenomenon. From the Omaha Daily Bee, April 17, 1881, the rise of mud in the lower districts continues. Several shop owners on Douglas Street report their entrances now require steps descending where none were needed last season. From the Portland Oregonian, June 3, 1873, the old boardwalks are now some feet beneath the present grade. Merchants have adapted by building upward, though some speak of the lower rooms as lost entirely. From the Charleston Courier, November 12, 1868. The streets near the wharves have risen considerably since the war. Foundations laid 10 years prior now sit submerged beneath the new ground. These aren't describing construction projects. They're describing something happening to the ground itself, gradually, noticeably, repeatedly. Then, after about 1895, the language changes. The same events are now described as planned civic improvements. The city has approved the grade elevation project, street raising to commence, fill material to be hauled from nearby quarries. The phenomenon is reframed as a solution, not a mystery. But here's what's strange. In many cases, the newspapers describe the raising as already completed before the official civic records claim the project was approved. In Seattle, for example, newspaper reports in 1891 describe businesses operating at the new grade and the old level as sealed. But the city's official street improvement bonds for the project weren't issued until 1893. In Galveston, accounts from 1901 describe fill operations underway, but the formal grade-raising project wasn't officially authorized until 1902. It's as if the physical transformation was already happening and the civic machinery was simply codifying it after the fact. There's a particular kind of photograph that appears over and over in the archives of 1880s and 1890s American cities. I found hundreds of them. They show street scenes, usually commercial districts, brick buildings, pedestrians, horse-drawn carriages. Perfectly normal except for one detail. At the base of many buildings, you can see windows, not basement windows set into wells. Windows at street level, half buried in the dirt, sometimes with glass still intact, sometimes with curtains visible behind them. No construction equipment, no workers digging. Just windows, slowly disappearing into the earth as if the ground were rising around them. The captions on these photographs, when there are captions, almost never mention this. They describe the street, the businesses, the year, but not the buried windows that are clearly visible in the frame. I showed a collection of these to my geomorphologist friend. I asked her, if this were a construction project, if the city were deliberately raising the streets, wouldn't there be evidence of the work in progress? Wouldn't these photographs show the filling happening? She said, yes. You'd see carts, workers, piles of material. This looks like something that's already done, or still happening passively. I asked what she meant by passively. She said, like deposition, like the material is accumulating on its own. Why is there no unified historical record of what should have been one of the greatest infrastructure projects of the 19th century? If 42 major American cities simultaneously elevated their street grades by an average of 14 feet, moving over 1 billion cubic yards of material using pre-industrial labor, That would be a coordinating achievement on the scale of the Transcontinental Railroad. It would be taught in schools. It would be a point of national pride. Instead, it's fragmented into dozens of small local stories. Seattle's underground, Chicago's jack screws, Galveston's grade raising, each treated as an isolated civic achievement, unrelated to the others. And the explanation for each one is always localized. Always reactive, never coordinated. But the timeline, the methods, the scale, and the material all tell a different story. Something happened between roughly 1850 and 1900 that required cities across the world to adapt to a new ground level. Something that deposited a massive quantity of fine sedimentary material across urban areas in a relatively short period of time. Something that wasn't a flood in the traditional sense, because floods don't leave buildings intact with their first floors perfectly preserved underground. The official history has no framework for this. So it was broken into pieces, localized, and explained away as dozens of unrelated civic projects. But the buildings know. The doors that open into dirt know. The buried windows know. The geologic testing that shows non-local fill material knows. We just stopped asking what they're telling us. This is the part I keep returning to. In nearly every city that underwent a major street-grade elevation, there was a catastrophic fire within the decade before. Chicago, 1871. Seattle, 1889. Boston, 1872. Baltimore, 1904. San Francisco, 1906. These fires are famous. They're well documented. What's less discussed is what happened immediately after. In almost every case, the fire destroyed not just buildings, but records. Municipal archives, property deeds, birth and death records, maps, everything that would establish what the city looked like before. And then, in the process of rebuilding, the street grade was raised. The old ground level was filled in. The buildings that survived were adapted to the new elevation or torn down. The official explanation is practical. The fires created an opportunity to improve infrastructure, to modernize, to correct the drainage and sanitation problems that had plagued these cities. But if that's true, why do the pre-fire photographs show buildings that don't look poorly drained or unsanitary? Why do they show robust commercial districts with multi-story brick and stone buildings, paved streets, functional infrastructure? And why, in so many cases, do the records specifically note that the old level is being sealed, not excavated? Why fill it in if the plan was simply to raise the streets? Unless the goal wasn't to raise the streets. The goal was to bury what was already there. Seattle's underground is one of the few places where the old ground level remains accessible. It's a tourist attraction now. You can walk through the old storefronts, sidewalks, and doorways that once opened onto busy streets. The tour guides tell the official story. The city raised the streets after the 1889 fire to prevent flooding from Puget Sound. The old level was filled in. Skylights were installed in the new sidewalks above to let light down to the buried shops, which operated for a few years before being abandoned. But when you're down there, the official story stops making sense. The buried level isn't crude or utilitarian. It's finished. Painted walls, tiled floors, gas lamp fixtures, wooden display cases, decorative molding. These were permanent working businesses built to last. And they're not flooded, they're dry. The flooding problem the street raising was supposed to solve doesn't seem to have affected them. What the tour doesn't mention is the depth. 18 feet of fill material deposited and compacted in about 3 years. The tour also doesn't mention that many buildings show evidence of multiple buried levels, not just one floor underground, but 2, sometimes 3. In 2003, during an expansion of the underground tour, workers broke through a wall and found a staircase leading down to another level beneath the original ground floor. That level was sealed again and is not part of the public tour. I filed a public records request with the city of Seattle asking for documentation of what was found. The request was denied. The reason given: structural safety concerns. Dr. Harlow's unpublished notes contain a detail that changed how I understood all of this. In several buried levels he studied in San Francisco, he found evidence that the spaces had been deliberately sealed from the inside. Doors barricaded, windows bricked over from within, ventilation shafts plugged, as if whoever was down there in the final days was trying to keep something out, or in. His notes describe finding on Market Street a room that had been used as a makeshift hospital. Cots still in place, medical instruments, bottles of carbolic acid, a disinfectant commonly used in the 1880s and 1890s, but no records of a hospital at that location. No mentions in city directories, no licenses, no permits. just physical evidence of people living and working an entire story below what is now considered ground level. Harlow wrote, "It is as though a parallel city existed beneath the one we know and was suddenly, deliberately sealed away. His papers were never published. His family donated them to the Historical Society after he died, where they sat in an archive for 22 years before I found them. The same phenomenon appears in Europe, Russia, and parts of Asia. In Omsk, Siberia, buildings show 2 buried floors. City records claim the streets were raised once, in 1893, for flood control. But the buildings show 2 distinct elevations beneath the current ground level, suggesting 2 separate events. In Edinburgh, Scotland, the vaults beneath the South Bridge are treated as historical curiosities. Built in the late 1700s, supposedly used as storage and workshops, then abandoned and filled in during the 1800s. But the architecture doesn't match that story. The vaults are vaulted stone chambers with finished interiors, designed for occupation. Archival records from the 1830s describe them as suddenly lost to rising damp and earth, as if the ground level rose around them. In Krakow, Poland, the Rynek Underground Museum shows a medieval market square now an entire story beneath the current square. The official explanation, centuries of rebuilding and debris accumulation. But the timeline doesn't work. The buried level dates to the 1500s and 1600s. The current level was established by the mid-1800s. That's roughly 10 feet of accumulation in under 300 years, in a city that wasn't growing at a rate to explain that volume. Across every continent, the same pattern. Buried first floors, sealed levels. Official explanations that are localized, practical, and just plausible enough to avoid scrutiny. But when you map them all at once, the explanation stops working. In every city where geologic testing has been done on the fill used to raise street grades, the results are the same. The material is not local. It resembles loess, a fine sediment typically deposited by wind or water over long periods in specific geologic conditions. River valleys, glacial plains. But the cities where this material appears are not in loess regions. And even if they were, the quantity is wrong. You don't get 10 to 20 feet of uniform loess deposition across an urban area in 30 years through natural processes. You get it over millennia. The official records say quarries, nearby hills, excavation from other parts of the city. But when you trace those records, they don't add up. In Chicago, the volume of fill documented in the street-raising projects between 1855 and 1900 is estimated at over 200 million cubic yards. The quarries cited in municipal records have a total documented output of less than half that. The same discrepancy appears in San Francisco, Seattle, Galveston. The documented sources cannot account for the volume used. So where did the rest come from? No one asks. The records simply state that the work was done and the streets were raised. The explanation they chose not to investigate. There is a body of geological research, published mostly in the early 20th century, then quietly discontinued, that studied catastrophic deposition events. These were events where massive quantities of sediment were deposited rapidly across large areas through single or repeated high-energy events. Volcanic eruptions, glacial outburst floods, mega tsunamis. The research was rigorous. The findings were clear. These events happened. But they also created a problem. If you acknowledge that such events can deposit 10 to 20 feet of sediment across hundreds of square miles in days or weeks, then you have to ask whether it happened recently. And if it happened recently, you have to explain why we don't have records of it. The research stopped, not because it was disproven, because it was inconvenient. By the 1920s, the dominant geological framework was uniformitarianism, the idea that processes shaping the Earth operate slowly, gradually, uniformly, over vast timescales. Catastrophism, the older idea that sudden, violent events could reshape landscapes, was dismissed as unscientific. But the buried first floors don't fit uniformitarianism. They fit catastrophism. And so they were explained away, city by city, as civic projects, human choices, planned improvements, not as evidence of something that happened to the Earth. If the buried first floors were the result of planned street raisings, you would expect the projects to be staggered. Different cities, different times, based on local needs, available funding, engineering capacity. But that's not what happened. The projects clustered. Between 1870 and 1900, the vast majority of major street-grade elevations in the United States occurred, not spread over a century, over 30 years. In Europe, the same clustering appears, between 1850 and 1890. In Russia and Siberia, the window is narrower, 1860 to 1895. These are not random, these are coordinated, whether by design or by response to a shared condition, and the shared condition was not industrial growth or public health awareness. Those factors existed before and after this window. What makes this 30 to 50-year period unique is not what was built, it's what was buried. I found a letter in the Oregon Historical Society archives, written in 1897 by a merchant named Samuel Chadwick in Portland to his brother in Boston. The letter was never mailed. It was found among his effects after his death and donated to the society by a descendant in 1954. In it, he writes, "But John, I must tell you something I do not speak of in polite company, for I am thought strange enough already. The Portland I walk today is not the Portland I knew as a young man, it is higher, not the buildings, the ground itself. The old storefronts where I worked in my youth are now below the street. I have seen them through grates and cellar windows. They are still there, perfectly preserved, as though waiting for someone to return. But no one speaks of it. When I ask the city engineers, they smile and talk of fill and drainage. But I was here, John. I remember. The ground rose, and we simply built atop it and pretended it had always been so." The letter ends there. Samuel Chadwick died in 1899. No cause is listed in the death records. His letter was filed under miscellaneous personal correspondence and hasn't been digitized. I found it by accident. If you live in a city built before 1900, there is a version of that city beneath you, not a ruin, a complete functioning level sealed away and forgotten, streets that were walked, rooms that were lived in, businesses that operated, lives that were lived at a ground level that no longer exists. You can find the evidence. Doors that open into dirt, windows half buried in sidewalks, buildings with architectural features that make no sense at the current elevation, grand entrances that are now in basements, second-story windows at street level. The official story will tell you these are basements, foundations, poor planning. But the physical evidence tells you something else. These spaces were not built underground, they were built at ground level. And then the ground changed. We don't have a framework that allows for the earth to change that quickly, that recently, that uniformly across so many places at once. So we don't talk about it. We build tours in Seattle. We fill in the spaces everywhere else. We teach the fires, the floods, the civic improvements. And we walk on streets that are 18 feet higher than they were when our great-great-grandparents were young. The buildings remember. The doors remember. The buried windows, still intact behind 15 feet of fill, still reflect light that no longer reaches them. The question I cannot stop asking is whether any of this was accidental, whether the fires that destroyed the records were coincidence, whether the simultaneous decision by dozens of cities to raise their streets and bury the old levels was independent planning or coordinated response, whether the ground rose on its own or whether something made it rise, and why, when the evidence is still visible, still measurable, still waiting beneath our feet, we have agreed as a civilization to call it basements and move on. Because we buried the people who knew, or we buried the records, or we buried the questions. But we didn't bury the buildings. They're still there. And if you go down far enough, you can still open the doors.